Good evening. Welcome to Talk Gnosis. We are going to continue our discussion on the Gospel of Thomas. How are you, Bishop Peterson?
I'm doing well. How are you, Bishop Canterbury?
Very good. Well, I guess it's time to dive right into our discussion on the Gospel of Thomas. This week we're going to be discussing verse 12 after going through what we thought was going to be the painful verse of verse 11 a few weeks ago. You want to go ahead and read this for our viewers, those who are not familiar with the text?
Sure. This is the Bentley Layton version, or translation, I should say. And it goes like this. The disciples said to Jesus, "We are aware that you will depart from us. Who will be our leader?" Jesus said to him, "No matter where you come, it is to James the just that you shall go, for whose sake heaven and earth have come to exist." So what we have here is actually something pretty straightforward. The disciples are asking, when you leave us, who should we go to? And he's saying, you go to James the Just, and for whose sake heaven and earth have come to exist. Now, some people I've read have tried to read a lot into that last line, for whose sake heaven and earth have come to exist. Marvin Meyer, one of the translators of the Nag Hammadi, has actually said that this was simply a term of great praise for somebody that was common in Jewish literary sources. So it was as if I would call you, Bishop Ken, a prince among men, or Father Tony a good egg. I'm not saying that you're royalty or that Father Tony is a breakfast protein. It's just, it's very, very high praise. And it is pretty well known that James the Just was very highly regarded. He was the bishop in Jerusalem, and commonly referred to as the brother of our Lord. Now, there are some who do not believe that he was actually the literal brother of Jesus. Those who believe that Mary remained a virgin will argue that, in fact, he was probably a cousin of Jesus, one of Jesus's cousins, or perhaps a son of Joseph, Jesus's foster father from a previous marriage. Others, Protestants, have said no. The fact that he's referred to as the Lord's brother indicates that, in fact, Mary and Joseph had normal relations after Christ was born, and that so he was, in fact, Jesus's brother. But in any case, James the Just was very highly regarded. He's also the individual to whom the book of James in the canonical New Testament is attributed to. And I've often spoken of this, but that happens to be my very favorite book in the whole Bible.
Interesting.
So any case, so basically what he's saying is, Jesus is saying, go to James the Just, which is interesting for a number of reasons. For one, many people, and historically, Peter has been said to have been Christ's successor, the idea of he was head of the church after Christ departed. But here in this book, here in Thomas, people are being told to go to James, not to Peter, which I think is interesting.
Well, yeah, I find the whole entire question of authority interesting here. Like you said, there's this evidence that the regular Orthodox Church points to with the authority to Peter, and they will claim several biblical verses to kind of give them supportive evidence of Peter. And even those of us in a Gnostic apostolic succession, even though many churches claim a direct lineage to John, most also in their lineage have a line of Peter. And in fact, it was that Petrine line that many claimed gave them a certain amount of credibility, if you will. But yet here we're seeing that authority kind to James. And again, it's James. It's not Peter. In Gnostic wise, it's not John. It's James, which I find interesting. I find it interesting because, does this kind of lead us on kind of a mystery trail on other things that we need to investigate, like the secret book of James, for an example? Are there certain things in there that, am I overlooking? Do I need to pay more attention now to this because it's saying James,
Yeah, pay attention. This is something that's possibly worth investigating. I also note, and I went through the Gospel of Thomas before this show, and I was just kind of reviewing it. And there's a couple of mentions of Peter in the Gospel of Thomas, and one of them, it's even questionable how authentic the verse is. But one, Jesus is asking his disciples to describe who he is, and Peter, I believe it was, came up and said, "Well, you're a messenger," and he does not have really the fullness of who Jesus was, and neither does Matthew. But then Thomas gives a more satisfactory answer, kind of a non-answer, but it's more satisfactory, it appears. And then at the end of this book, of the Gospel of Thomas, you have Peter arguing. I believe it was it Peter? When it was the disciples, I think, talking about how Mary is not fit to be a disciple, and so because she's a female. So, and some people have questioned whether that passage was ever authentic to the Gospel of Thomas, but you don't really have Peter as an authority. He's not being set out. Now, of course, this is a collection of sayings, so we can't expect him to have a major role as he would, say, have in the canonical Gospels. But it is curious, to me at least, that when this Gospel does speak of authority, it does not point to Peter.
Yeah, and again, I think that's what I pretty much kind of draw to this also. There's, not much pointing to Peter and the authority. And, I'm still being led to what I was saying earlier is, where is this leading us to? What is it that this is kind of giving us that command to look at? Is it simply just a recognition of James the person? Or is it much more than that? Is it for us as Gnostics to really be investigating some of those secret teachings that are attributed to James, or even looking deeper into more esoteric meanings, into what we find in the Bible, in the book of James? I mean, you mentioned yourself that the book of James is one of your favorites. Maybe, you can share with us, why? Is there any particular passages in James that you're really drawn to, that maybe can help our listeners maybe make kind of that, I don't know, jump towards James even?
Well, there's the bit about faith without works being dead. And I know that offends a lot of people. I know Martin Luther had said, called it the gospel or the epistle of straw, the book of James, because he didn't like that idea. But, James is pretty straightforward. Okay, so you believe in this. Well, good for you. So do the demons, and they tremble. Big deal. Yeah, big deal. If you're not willing to if your religion is not creating a change in you, maybe you need to rethink what it is exactly that you believe. I also like the teachings about how the untamed tongue, about how our words and what we say gets us into trouble. And I think for me, that particular epistle says, it points to our power, the kind of power that we have to potentially wreak havoc in our lives and in the lives of others, and as well as our power to truly repent and for there to be some real change. But for me, it's it speaks a lot to the idea that if your religion is any good, it ought to have a hand in making you a better person. And if you are if you remain a rat bastard while proclaiming your belief in somebody who taught a pretty high standard of morality, there may be a problem here. In fact, there is a problem. Now, and I just going back to what you were saying, was this passage pointing to trying to encourage us to go into a more esoteric way of thinking about church authority or these teachings? Another possibility is that this might have indicated that a preference for what was going on in Jerusalem. I mean, Peter went on to Rome. This may indicate, for example, that the people who kept these sayings were perhaps looking more towards the Jewish community there, possibly as a source of other teachings as well. I mean, there are some other possibilities as to why this was included. I think they all require some study. But as I said, this passage is very interesting, given that it's quite specific in attributing to Jesus who he thought was his successor, or the person who was supposed to lead them afterwards.
Interesting. I think there are several points that you and I obviously agree on, and I think one of the points that you and I have always agreed on is it may be not so with everyone who claims to be Gnostic or even Christian as far as that goes, but the idea of sort of these teachings of James, of having works manifest to show this kind of transformative effect. Recently, I was involved in a consecration, and one of the bishops who was the co-consecrator with me, his advice to the newly consecrated bishop was kind of humorous, but it was direct to the point, is don't be a butthead. Don't be a butthead. I think we've all come and we've met people who study the esoteric. They belong to initiatory organizations. They on paper look great. They've got diplomas and degrees all over their walls, and they can speak multiple languages. They can speak French or Greek or Latin or whatever the case is, and they seem very well educated. They may even seem on the surface to have quite a bit of gnosis, but yet their tongue betrays them. There is bitterness, there is anger, there is an unwillingness to actually teach gnosis to those around them. They don't have any expressions of love manifest in their life. Things that, you and I kind of take for granted that, hey, this is kind of a manifestation of gnosis. So for me, when I see that towards James, I think you pointed our listeners in a very good direction there, is that, this is what James is saying here in this epistle, and you got to kind of pay attention to that, because why good is any of this if there is no transformation in any of our lives?
Yeah.
Yeah. It becomes, as we talk many times, nothing more than mental masturbation. Yep. If there is no transformative effect, and that is one of the big arguments I talk with people when it comes to Gnosis. To me, Gnosis causes a direct transformation, more so than faith alone. Faith alone, can it cause transformation? I don't know. I'm not a person of faith alone. I'm a person of faith and Gnosis. But I know for me, Gnosis causes a transformation. And so I believe that transformation should also manifest in others. And it should be some form of physical manifestation. We can see the works being done. And then we have many great brethren that we know of who we have seen the effects that it has done, whether it is works of charity, whether it is works of outreach, whether it is works of putting to pen what they've learned to teach to others, even like our own Father Tony, who has written his great little book, which has helped lead others into the path. There are some forms of expression of this, and to me, I think that is kind of a great pointing to James right there, and I have to agree with you. I think that's a great way to kind of tie all of this in together.
I think it is too, and I think that James is certainly somebody somebody that people ought to pay attention to, and certainly I recommend the canonical epistle of James to everybody. I think it's a wonderful thing to read and be mindful of. One of the things that's also occurred to me, of course, about this passage is that this passage may have been placed in there by this community because they were deliberately attempting to distance themselves from those who may have associated with Peter and with Rome. So this may have also been something that it reflected a hostility on the part of the community to put this together. So there's that possibility as well.
Oh, and absolutely.
It's regardless of what it is, I mean, it's pointing in an opposite direction. Now, was this Was this the work of theological revisionists who, didn't, wanted to point away from somebody who might be calling them on heresy? Or was this the work of people who felt that the people who were tilting the other way were the heretics? I don't know. But this is definitely a passage that points in a different direction, and I think it's worth noting and being aware of. And I think that it can also possibly have some contemporary applications when we consider authority within churches even today. And we're going to get into that a little bit more, I think, in After Dark in the podcast as well. So
awesome. Well, we should probably just continue this in the podcast. Any news this week?
I don't have any particular news, although I will say that we have a very exciting show planned for next week.
Fantastic.
Bishop John Plummer is going to be talking to us about the independent sacramental movement. Bishop John Plummer is an old friend of mine. As a matter of fact, he had been made a bishop the same weekend I was ordained to the priesthood, and was one of the bishops at my ordination when I became a priest. And old friend of mine. He's also written quite a bit on the independent sacramental movement. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this term, we've used it a couple times on this show, but some Gnostic groups and organizations or churches are part of what's called the independent sacramental movement, a very diverse movement of churches that practice a sacramental theology, that hold to a sacramental theology, have liturgical services, and oftentimes have some form of apostolic succession. And so Bishop Plummer is a pretty well-noted expert on this movement. He's going to come and talk to us about it, which I think is going to be great show for everybody. And he's incredibly knowledgeable and gifted man. So it's going to be a really good show next week.
That is awesome. Again, I want to make sure that I give a plug to all of our supporters. We want to thank them. Thank you very much for supporting this show and everything of Gnostic NYC. If you've enjoyed the show and if you find it helpful for you, and if you've been recommending this to your friends and others, make sure that you do pledge your support. You can go to Patreon, that's patreon.com/Gnostic. You can pledge a small amount per show. You can cap it. Bishop Laney has mentioned this many times. I mean, if you say, my God, my budget's $5 a month and you don't want to spend more than $5, cap it at $5. If your budget is $2 a month, cap it at $2. But we appreciate any bit of support that we can get for you. You can pledge a small amount per video or per our podcast. And your support directly supports this and all of our other developing programs.
All right.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. We appreciate your continuous support, and make sure you listen to our upcoming episode of Talk Gnosis After Dark. We will be continuing this discussion on the Gospel of Thomas. Good night, everyone.
Night.